Okay, thank you for inviting me and for the opportunity to share some reflections about Teilhard de Chardin, especially at nap time. I hope they will be too live. So the title of which was proposed to me, Teilhard's Theology and Ignatian Spirituality, this title, I must admit, leads me to a bit perplexity, because I'm not sure that Teilhard had a theology, but I will explain that afterwards. And concerning Ignatian spirituality, as we learned this morning, it's other sometimes problematic expression, but I won't add any reflections about these two issues. So first of all, which is to... Oh, yeah, good. Yeah. First of all, I would begin by some general reflections. Where Teilhard was a Jesuit, as you know, it was mainly a scientist, paleontologist, and his first activity was, in fact, in science, in the field or in laboratories. It's important to have this in mind. It is not a thinker, a philosopher, or less a theologian, but a man of a practical activity, and especially in science, a researcher. But at the same time, he was a Jesuit, and as Henri de Lubac wrote in his famous book on Teilhard de Chardin, La pensée religieuse du Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, he was a faithful but free disciple of Saint Ignatius. You see, two interesting epithets. Faithful, sure, he was a real profound spiritual person, of course, faithful, but free disciple. His interpretation of Ignatius, we'll see, is marked by some freedom. But in fact, in his work, we find interesting expressions that, in fact, reflect his traditional spiritual Ignatian spirituality. In his retreat notes, I will quote from time to time his retreat notes, the only text that deals really with Ignatian explicit Ignatian background. We find this expression, make God real in life. It is typical of his approach of spirituality. The spirituality is really incarnated in the real world. So make God real in life. Another expression, which is from the famous book, which is another fundamental reference of Teilhard spirituality, the Divine Milieu, to see God everywhere. Maybe this expression reminds you something you've read in Latin somewhere, to see God everywhere. So it is typical of his approach, but I think it needs no more commentary. But in fact, I will add some more developed expression from the same book, The Divine Milieu. By virtue of the creation, and still more of the incarnation, nothing here below is profane for those who know how to see. For those who know how to see. On the contrary, everything is sacred to the man, human person, if you prefer, who can distinguish that portion of chosen being which is subject to Christ's drawing power in the process of consummation. So, it is once again the main typical expression of his approach of spirituality. So another final remark for my introduction. It would be a dead end to compare Teilhard expressions of spirituality with what we know today as Ignatian spirituality. Because, of course, the Ignatian way he knew at the time, as we learned this morning, is quite different than the path we know today. So, for instance, just to give you an example, his main critique to Ignatius, well, to the exercise as he understood that, is the obsession for sin, the obsession for original sin. So for him, it was a problematic approach to anthropology to begin by the sin, the sinner, human person as a sinner. Okay, so let me go on by underlining. I would underline some what seems to me the most important components of Teilhardian way of proceeding. We say the expression is well known. The first point I would like to insist upon is it is a researcher. It is searching the importance of research. Research for him is not an activity among many. It should be the central activity of the human person. The human person is in research because we live in a world in evolution. And since the world is in evolution, we cannot limit ourselves to a complete theoretical system. We have in every step something new to know. And the human life is a never-ending process. And the world is a never-ending process. And he usually criticized theologians, what he called theologians, quotation marks, criticized theologians for claiming to hold the ultimate solution that dispenses all research. That for him, the theology is the idea, the illusion to hold the ultimate solution. So this is a typical expression for him. This is a writing of the time of war, about the 1916 or 17, I don't remember exactly. Completely, that could be written on the entrance door of Faculty of Theology. A completely lucid and orthodox synthesis are necessary, sterile, and forced by omission. Okay. No more commentary, you understand? And what he wants to defend is what I so desire to propagate is not precisely a theory, a system, a Weltanschauung, but a certain taste, a certain perception of beauty, of the pathetic, of the unity of being. It's a letter to Ida Treat, the years about 20. So, and he said elsewhere that if he would have been a musician, he would prefer to express his intuitions as music or a piece of art than a system. By parenthesis, some people took from Teilhard a system of thought. This is, of course, not only a mistake, but a contradiction. So his spirituality is essentially a lived spirituality, because spirituality stems from a reducibly personal experience. The experience is fundamental to his way of proceeding. Second point I would like to underline is seeing. We noticed that the importance of seeing. This is the beginning of the phenomenon of man, or human phenomenon as we translate now. This work may be summed up as an attempt to see and make others see what happens to man. What happens, which is important. God reveals himself in what happens, and what conclusions are forced upon us when he is placed, man, fairly and squarely within the framework of phenomenon and appearance. First of all, we have to look at the world, we have to see the world, and to become aware of what happens in the present time. Once again, is coming back to the experience. No theory can exhaust the experience. So in another expressions he loves is not from his own expression, but he likes to write from time to time. Love what happens because it happens. This is central for understanding is. So seeing the first step, I would say. Second step is acting. There's a spirituality of action. Once again, I quote the divine milieu. In fact, through the unceasing operation of the incarnation, well, incarnation I would come back on it because it's absolutely central, through the unceasing operation of incarnation, it is not finished. The creation is not finished. It's a continuous process. The divine so thoroughly permeates all our creaturely energies that in order to meet it and lay hold on it, we could not find a more fitting setting than that of our action. It's not only contemplation, well, I would say contemplation in action is nothing very new, but in fact, seeing is intimately linked with acting. The third step, I would say, is maybe the other side. Once again, since Teilhardian approach is sensitive to the processual aspect of the world, is maybe better translation into a kind of metaphysics should be dialectical metaphysics. I mean, it's a permanent dialectic. So after the acting aspect, there is a mysticism. So the best way to get into it is to read what the definition he gives to mysticism. What I mean here by mysticism is the need, the science and the art of attaining simultaneously and each through the other, the universal and the spiritual, to become at the same time and by the same act, one with all through release from all multiplicity or material gravity. So, which I would like to underline there, to take at the same time the universal and the spiritual, to take at the same time the unity of all things, which is maybe the definition of mystical part, to perceive the unity, mystical unity of all, and the multiplicity, and perceive the unity through the multiplicity and through the matter. Just let me make here a parenthesis. In his own life, in his own, we say, spiritual life, but not dependent on his ordinary life, I would say, in his spiritual life, his first step is, he said in his autobiography at the end of his life, when he was young, the research of what is the more consistent in being. And for him, the more consistent in being, at the first level, is the hardest, is, for instance, the stone or the metal, because it lasts on the contrary of the living matter, and the living matter disappears very easily. He was very impressed by seeing a piece of matter burning in the fire. But after he understood that, in fact, this so-called permanency of stone and metal is not real permanency, it's not a real consistency of matter, because the stone can be broken and the metal can rust. But on the contrary, the living matter is fruitful. The living matter could disappear, but disappearing, giving life to other living matter. So this is the reason why he can take at the same time the matter, as the importance of the matter, but seeing through it the movement, the dynamic of life. Okay, let's, yeah. This dialectic I would like to analyze especially action and mystical part or mysticism, which could be summed as activity and passivity. The divine milieu, the main part of divine milieu is divided into two parts. The first part is divinization of activity, which is what usually we remember of Teilhard de Chardin, who is an active man, as many Jesuits are, which is dedicated to action, research, and so forth. But the majority of this part is dedicated to passivity. And not only the passivity of developing, but the passivity of decreasing, passivity de diminution, exactly what to translate, the passivity of even to the death. I mean, and in fact, the issue is, the goal is to discover God's action even in what we seems to us as the extreme of passivity, which is exactly the point where we can, acting, but through action, going step by step to this passivity and that thing. Yeah, sorry, I just jumped over a part, which is the inconvenience of not reading my text. Just let me get back a little bit to the mysticism. Just to, in a parenthesis, just 3 elements I would like to add. The importance of union for him. He had a text which is called the Creative Union, l'Union Créatrice. And it could be dialectically interpreted. Every union is creative. Okay, I say, I understand, every relationship is creative. And every creation is united, is a process of communion. So, and for him, this is not very extraordinary, but something to have in his mind. For him, salvation, the goal of existence, is communion in God, communion together. So the history of the world is tensed into between two poles, the poles of dispersion, delusion, and the pole of communion. The importance of communion. And concerning spirituality, the central expression for him in the Eucharist. I could have mentioned the Holy Heart, but the Holy Heart is sometimes difficult, especially in the French context. But I will just, Sacred Heart, I will just let it aside. But the Eucharist, for him, is the place where exactly we meet this expression of communion. There is a central text, is the Mass over the world, la Messe sur le monde, which is, as you know, the central expression of it. Okay, so let's go further. Activity and passivity. So let's back to matter. As you understood, matter is the first step of development of being. And at the first level, matter is the state of dispersion, is a state of lack of communion. But, and there were two poles, matter and spirit. Spirit is being communion. But once again, it's a dialectical process, so I'll explain that. First of all, he has this interesting expression, holy matter. I read in the divine milieu. The divine milieu receives some censure in Rome, and the censor at that time, was a Jesuit, I forgot the name, when he saw this expression, holy matter, he put at least 4 or 5 exclamation marks. No, what is it? In fact, holy matter, why? Just let me gather. Because nothing is at the same time closer to us and further away from us than matter. You see, which is, once again, the dialectical approach is very, I forgot which text. Anyway, so we are very familiar with matter, and at the same time, matter is very far from us. So let's explain that more precisely. On the one hand, matter is burden, the fetters, the pain, the sin, the threat to our lives. It weighs us down, suffers, wants, tempts, and grows old. Okay. But at the same time, matter is a physical exuberance, this is more developed, ennobling contact, ideal effort, and the joy of growth. It attracts, renews, unites, and flowers. By matter, we are nourished, lift up, linked to everything else, invaded by life. What is matter understood in the sense I gave? You see, living matter, not, of course, and discovering what is real matter, which is not, as a first glance, the permanency of solid buildings or so, but living matter, which is full of perspectives, full of possibilities. And the first step of matter is inert matter, second step is living matter, and I would add the third step of matter is human matter, is human person, because we are part of matter, we are made of matter, we are not pure spirit. God is, maybe this is supposed to be, but I'm not sure, pure spirit, but we are matter. So, and since Teilhard is evolution man, who is qualified, he knows that human person comes from the process of evolution, beginning by inert matter through living matter, through plants, animals, and so forth, and eventually humanity. But so we are dust of stars, as it was famous expressions, as we know now more precisely. But for him, it was no difficulty to realize that we are. This is a fundamental solidarity with all what is material, and we have to begin with that. From that, this solidarity of all creatures. All the creatures are the same matter, I would say. So let me get a step further, because at the moment I realize that I have not spoken very intensely of spiritual issues of God. I didn't pronounce the word God for the moment. So now let me, first of all, because I'm theologian, you understand that Teilhardian spirituality is fundamental Christological. There is no path to get to God except to Christ, because Christ is God incarnate, is God in matter. So this quotation is quite transparent. By definition and in essence, Christianity is the religion of the incarnation. God uniting, once again, union. God uniting himself, God's self, if you prefer, for the Americans. God uniting himself, I could the translation, the old translation, with the world, which he created, to unify it, and in some sort incorporate it in himself. To the worshipper of Christ, this act expresses the history of the universe. Well, this is, once again, a summary of his theology. Well, in fact, he has some theology. So, another quotation which is very similar. By his incarnation, Christ has inserted himself not only into humanity, but into the universe that bears humanity. You see, for Teilhard, there is, what we call now in theology, a deep incarnation. When the incarnation is not only in humanity as such, but since humanity is part of the whole creation, the incarnation is in creation as such in general. So there is what Teilhard called the cosmic dimension of Christ. He had the expression which is not very good for me, the third nature of Christ, the God, divine nature, human nature, and cosmic nature. But you see, it is evident because since the human nature includes more an extended dimension, which is cosmic dimension. So once again, for Teilhard, this idea of communion with God is not an form of escaping the world from the matter to the spirit, but incorporate all the dimensions of our life in God. So the communion goes to the cosmical dimension. Just a short remark, and we'll get to my next point and to my final point. What about the insistence of the cosmic dimension of Christ? Is it at the opposite, or is a problem for the Jesus of the historical Jesus? In fact, it is one of the many questions that sometimes the Teilhardian thought could put to us. But in fact, Teilhard was not very interested in the details of Jesus' life. For him, it's more the cosmic Christ. It's more the Colossians, the epistle of the Colossians Christ, the cosmic dimension of Christ, than the historical Jesus. He was he read more John and Paul than the synoptics, in fact. But even if for him the historical dimension is important, but in his text he didn't pay more attention to that. But despite this remark, there is in the divine milieu, for instance, the central importance of the cross and the resurrection. Well, I insisted on the incarnation in de facto as a central part and the main cornerstone of his thinking, the incarnation. But without this transformation, we say, through death and through death, so this crossing to death, there is no real access to life. Because, once again, life is a process of permanent transformation. And for him, the death of Christ on the cross is not a kind of sacrifice or sufferance. And for him, it's not the important point. Okay. But it is a necessary process of radical transformation to access to real life. Not easy, the Christological could speak hours about that, but just I would content with these few remarks. And my last point, I think I will finish in a couple of minutes. My last point is the role of the church. You know probably the difficulties, Teilhard, to say the least, the difficulties Teilhard had with the church of his time. It was impossible for him to publish any text. He was sent to China, which is for him, it was a benediction to be sent to China because he had the opportunity to have a very interesting field of research, first of all. And being far from Rome, it was easier for him to express his ideas. So just to maybe you would agree with me. And so, but for him it was first of all, of course, a real difficulty. So despite these complex relationships with the church of his time and his criticism, he was not naive with this church. But for him, why the church? Because Christianism has a fundamental social or collective dimension, as for de Lubac at the same time. The danger of an individualistic reduction of the Christian faith, which is at that time, my relationship with God and the rest doesn't matter. For him, since the communion is universal, we cannot live in Christian not being united with all human persons, with all creatures and so forth. So the church is or should be the expression of this solidarity of communion. Well, of course, not the church as a particular group of the humanity, a particular group of saved or so-called saved people, a kind of elite of humanity, but a kind of promise of universal salvation, which is what the church should express, this dimension of potential universal salvation because of this solidarity and the desire of God to be in communion. So this is the expression I produced there. Without the church, Christ evaporates, crumbles, or disappears. So once again, he was, for him, this church or collective dimension of Christian faith is central. And he had a interesting commentary about the Sentire cum Ecclesia. He said, okay, the human person should feel with the church, Sentire cum Ecclesia, but the church should sentire cum mundo. So if the church doesn't sentire cum mundo, feel with the world, the humanity cannot. There is some contradiction to ask to feel with the church if the church doesn't feel with the world. And his main critique he addressed to the church of his time is the tendency to, I say, confessionalizing instead of dilating. Confessionalizing, is it right? Okay. To be enclosed in a confessional pattern instead of open the door and onto the world. So this solidarity, once again, should be the expression of the church. And for him, the church he believes in, as he said in the retreat notes, is a church ahead. The church should be concrete now expression, but we can hope that the church in the future would be more correspond to what God wants. So, thank you for your attention, which is I would like to share with you with Dr. Wright.
I want to thank Antoine for this opportunity and all my colleagues for their presentations. My topic is Bernard Lonergan and Ignatian spirituality. When I first began my studies in theology in the mid-1980s, this alignment seemed novel and even a bit controversial. Today, it feels natural and widely accepted. A great deal has occurred to unite or to reunite and integrate theology, spirituality, and history, as well as to take co-responsibility for building a more just and humane world. My presentation here relies principally on primary sources. I would like to acknowledge the work of my colleague Robert Dorn, who has made many important contributions as an interpreter of Lonergan and in the trajectory of his own creative thought. In the mid-20th century, Catholic intellectuals in North America often emerging from marginalized immigrant communities, sought to provide credible accounts of their pursuit of truth and intellectual integrity, independent of church authority and appeals to religious experience. In an intellectual landscape shaped by mainline established Protestantism, where reason and faith were dialectically related and spirituality was closely tied to piety, the Catholic integration of spirituality, religious practice, and theology was discreetly self-censored and relegated to enclosed seminary environments. This effective marginalization of spirituality contributed to a division between religiosity and academic research, as Catholic intellectuals endeavored to secure positions in higher education and sought recognition based on broadly accepted cultural standards. Many of Bernard Lonergan's early interpreters shared a similar apologetic motivation. They found resources in his philosophical exploration of cognitional theory, epistemology, and metaphysics presented in Insight, a Study of Human Understanding. Encouraged by his numerous references to mathematics and the empirical, natural, and social sciences, interpreters were tempted to position Lonergan as a contemporary modernist. While he valued philosophical investigation, Lonergan did not prioritize human reason over faith-based revelation. An exclusive focus on Insight's rational, empirically based argumentation overlooks the basis and trajectory of the text's overall self-transcending project, the significance of Lonergan's less accessible but nonetheless substantial revelation-based doctrinal and theological works, and the transcendental theme underpinning all of his works. Lonergan's second widely circulated monograph, Method in Theology, invites his interpreters to adopt a broader perspective. This methodological work and its 24 companion volumes in the recently completed Collected Works of Lonergan provide the literary context necessary to understand the significance of Lonergan's Jesuit heritage, particularly the influence of the spiritual exercises. Identifying 3 aspects of the spiritual exercises sheds light on this influence. First, an introductory meditation called The First Principle and Foundation proposes that spiritual practitioners place themselves within a vision of a goal-oriented, divinely created cosmos. The meditation invites practitioners to acknowledge their finitude as creatures, blessed with life and talents that are rightly dedicated to the praise, reverence, and service of the Creator God. In the instructions for the meditation, Ignatian proposes that, insofar as it remains conducive for the end for which they are created, practitioners should not prefer health to sickness, riches to poverty, honor to dishonor, a long life to a short life. As they reflect on a starkly worded articulation of their purpose in life, practitioners are challenged by strong emotional responses as they confront a theocentric worldview that displaces them from the center of their own horizon. The potential fruit of the exercise lies in the transition from self-protective anger and self-promoting ambition to gratitude for life, freedom in the use of talents, and commitment to service of a divine mission. Second, after the Principle and Foundation meditation, the exercises proceed as a series of imaginative activities that guide practitioners on an internal journey of self-discovery. Following the medieval monastic adaptation of the principles of Ciceronian rhetoric in the practice of mental prayer, the exercises promote heightened self-awareness through the active use of imagination in the prayerful contemplation of scriptural passages. Ignatian practitioners are invited to locate themselves within biblical scenes, often selected from the gospel accounts of the Nativity or public life of Christ. The thoughts and feelings shaping the imaginative flow of these contemplations become the basis for self-reflection. They are evaluated based on their source, development, and the fruit they produce to assess their spiritual influence. What is the source of an interior movement? Does the movement proceed from a sense of gifted union with the Creator, or from a place of isolation and despair? How does the prayer movement develop? Does gratitude and freedom wax or wane over the course of the time spent in contemplation? What is the fruit of the movement? Does the prayer confirm a commitment in service and yield an increase or decrease in faith, hope, and charity? The third aspect of the spiritual exercises we highlight is the Ignatian Examen, a daily reflective practice that cultivates inner noticing and self-interpretation through structured narration within a Christian context of meaning. 5 steps shape the practice. The first is a moment of petitionary prayer seeking a fundamental attitude of gratitude. The second step asks for the light of the Holy Spirit to shift the practitioner's perspective to share, as much as possible, a divine view of the day's events. Together, a grateful attitude and a divine perspective create a benevolent and secure context for crafting an honest narrative about the day. The third step involves recounting the story. Here we might recall the structure of Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Moses, which distinguishes between historia and theoria. Historia is merely a chronology of events. Theoria implots and interprets events by seeking to understand their meaning and causality. Did the flow of my thoughts and feelings over the course of the day bring me closer to God or lead me further away? Did the gift habits of faith, hope, and charity wax or wane? This third step constitutes the first telling of the story. As is often the case, some events may resist the attitude of gratitude and divine light. These dark events may challenge the progression of the story's plot. The fourth step addresses this resistance by approaching the light of the Paschal mystery. The unconditional love poured out from the cross pushes back the darkness and advances the story towards completion. This may be as simple as sorrowing over the harm done to values and replacing the parsing of blame and the deflection of responsibility with active concern in sharing Christ's redemptive mission of healing, mercy, and forgiveness. Lesser, self-focused agendas yield to the higher agenda of sharing in Christ's mission. The biblical story of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10 offers a helpful prompt for reflecting on this shift from self-concern to sharing in mission. The fifth step advances the story's trajectory by planning responsive action and confirming the agency of the practitioner. The Ignatian exploration of the interior life provides the context for Lonergan's theological achievement. As a Jesuit, Lonergan typically practiced the Examen twice daily. As he began this practice shortly after entering the Jesuit novitiate in July of 1922 and continued until his death in 1984, he potentially engaged in this structured interior reflection for up to 23,000 days, or more than 45,000 times. By consistently cultivating a self-aware, self-critical, goal-oriented life, Lonergan challenged social cultural tendencies that accommodate externally mediated lives centered on unreflective self-concern. We propose that the fruit of this sustained cultivation of an interior life is exemplified by his association of the foundation of theology with the self-transcending agency of converted human subjects. The priority he assigned to discerning the social movements of history over adhering to a static model of holiness, and the very core of his Trinitarian theology, affirming the pivotal insight of the Thomist psychological analogy as understanding in, not by, words. All these enable him to advance the Jesuit orientation to find God in all things. Lonergan affirms the basic tenets of a traditional theology of grace, which recognizes that we do not save ourselves, while affirming that God does not save us without us. We are gifted, social, and intelligent beings, profoundly shaped by diverse cultural and religious meanings and values, capable of experiencing transforming spiritual intimacy as we resolve our past and discern our future. Although this gift of spiritual intimacy precedes, accompanies, and surpasses all human activity, including our species-defining cognitive activities, we remain self-present, self-aware, and self-transcending individuals who experience the world beyond ourselves through our senses, inquire about potential patterns of intelligibility in our self-presence and the sensible world, critically evaluate the veracity of the intelligible patterns we constructively identify, and discern further matters regarding the value of potential paths of development in the dynamic flow of social and cosmic processes in light of a self-transcending goal. Lonergan invites us to enhance our critical self-awareness by discussing evolving historical consciousness and an empirical notion of culture. He draws our attention to how unfolding contexts of questions and concerns shape our understanding and its expression through the written word and other public instruments of meaning. Although he foregrounds the task of interpreting texts in the context of their expression, he clearly assumes and affirms that the contexts shaped by meanings and values evolve over time. In method, his earlier discussions of historical consciousness are coordinated with an empirical notion of culture. The meanings and values that inform ways of living do not simply evolve along a single track over time. They follow multiple pathways as diverse cultures unfold, coexist, and commingle. There is no normative stadial path of human development. Diverse cultures and languages enhance the resources available to receive the gospel and reflect on the meaning of the Paschal mystery. In a self-aware context that celebrates cultural diversity as a symphonic expression of divine bounty and creativity, Lonergan proposes that theology mediates between a cultural matrix and the significance and role of religion in that matrix. By situating theology in a transcultural context, Lonergan invites us to examine insights regarding the role and significance of religion within and beyond the meanings and values of any specific cultural framework. In response, we cultivate the intellectual flexibility and affective freedom necessary to learn from those inhabiting diverse cultures and traditions, supporting them as they construct their own religious meanings on their spiritual journeys. These open, supportive qualities may develop as reflective practitioners discern and compare spiritual movements across various contexts. We become less constrained by the assumptions and patterns of a perception associated with particular contexts. By accompanying others in their interior noticing, often through asking reflective questions grounded in open, respectful listening, we learn to recognize and interpret inner affective and intellectual responses to transcendent yearnings without requiring others to reside within the limitations of a common cultural identity. In his later post-method writings, Lonergan continues to refine the descriptions of interior noticing he shares with his readers. He delineates two distinct movements, creating and healing, that organize two patterns of interrelation among the four clusters of cognitional activities: empirical experiencing, hypothetical understanding, critical judgment, and evaluative deliberation. The creating pattern proceeds from sensible or interior empirical experience to hypothetical understanding, critical judgment, and evaluative deliberation. The healing pattern reverses this process, starting from the context of deliberately discerned value, which predisposes critical judgment, leads to elaborated hypothetical understanding, and finally guides intentional self and world-altering action. Of course, these two patterns do not occur in isolation or as a simple overlay. They commingle and interpenetrate, sometimes constructively and at other times causing distortions in perception, understanding, judgment, and discernment, but always in a complex manner. the quality of each pattern and the interaction between the two patterns are primarily guided by what Lonergan terms the transcendental imperatives: be attentive, be intelligent, be reasonable, be responsible, be in love. More remotely, they are habitually oriented toward the good, the true, and the beautiful by the four conversions identified by Lonergan and his interpreters in Augustine's Confessions. Psychic conversion guides the constructive interaction between sensation and the conscious self, such that the five senses become less points of breach for self-indulgent concupiscence and more pathways for finding the Creator in all things. Intellectual conversion opens the human project to affirming transcendent truths that require yet surpass iconic representation in material forms of expression. Moral conversion signals a shift from self-referential calculation of satisfactions to a commitment to promote value framed in a self-transcending context. Religious conversion revolves around the unconditional love of God, reaching toward a providential context for human living that is implotted in the Paschal narrative. Under the tactical impetus of transcendental imperatives and the strategic supervision of the four conversions, healing and creating patterns energize a dialogue between faith-born or religious love seeking understanding and self-transcending wonder grounded in sensible experience. This dialogue evolves as the healing movement reshapes the affective and cognitive dispositions that guide world-transforming action, while the creating movement searches for historical evidence of meaning and a higher purpose. Movement is a defining category and aesthetic sensitivity within Ignatian spirituality. As a dynamic feature, movement highlights the Thomist notion that humanity is created both in the image and to the image of God. This intellectual insight reflects an aesthetic awareness that challenges a static notion of holiness and an ahistorical approach to theology. Whether approaching or withdrawing from closer union, movement describes humanity's relationship with the divine. While transcendent truth is timeless and eternal in the inner love relations of the Trinity, these truths generate religious meaning and action for justice in the flow of history, even as cosmological process is shaped by the missions of Spirit and Word. The missions of Spirit and Word bring the ground and meaning of history, including human actions, into their fullest relief and most comprehensive context. While proximity to the divine is not irrelevant for Ignatius and Lonergan, the more practical and significant challenge lies not in discerning a practitioner's location, but in the direction of their movement. Am I approaching God in thought and feeling? Am I withdrawing into isolating self-sufficiency of pride and the despairing self-abasement of shame? Is this goal-oriented action, whether moving toward or away from greater divine union, accelerating or slowing down? The development of Lonergan's thought showcases a progressive integration of this dynamic perspective. After expressing an interest in studying the philosophy of history, Lonergan's religious superiors assigned him to study theology, which he pursued by investigating the historical evolution of the concept of operative grace in Thomas Aquinas. In subsequent work, he provided an analysis of the mind's development, transitioning from empiricism to idealism and then to critical realism as a way to interpret the evolution of Trinitarian doctrine. By the time Method in Theology was published decades later, he had nuanced these diachronic analyses, assessments of movements through stages of history, with a synchronic examination of progress, decline, and redemption, akin to a vector analysis of forces active simultaneously at any given moment in time. Lonergan identifies the authenticity and unauthenticity of human agents as the impetus behind progress and decline, proposing dialectical analyses to address the difficulty of assessing how the transcendent imperatives shape these measures of genuineness and alienation. In a brief post-Method article, Dialectic of Authority, he observes that while authenticity and unauthenticity, as measured by adherence or lack of adherence to the transcendental imperatives, can be attributed to those in authority, to those subject to authority, and to traditions that contextualize the use of authority, discerning the legitimate use of power to foster social collaboration involves assessing interior motivations, which is highly problematic and fraught with difficulty. In a pivotal move, Lonergan observes that inquiry into the legitimacy of authority or authorities is complex, lengthy, tedious, and often inconclusive. I invite the reader to recall with me Lonergan's Ignatian background as he proposes instead assessing social movements involving historical actions that can be evaluated in terms of progress, decline, and redemption. An Ignatian movement, not dissimilar to other movements, has a source, a development, and an end or fruit. Of course, the most compelling evidence to evaluate a movement is its fruit. All is laid bare in the outcome. The outcomes, from the perspective of discerning a possible course of action, however, is always a future contingency, not available at the point of decision. For public discourse, discerning based on the source brings us perilously close to the fraught area of investigating interior motivations. The development is promising for discerning the trajectory of a movement. Source motivations begin to manifest themselves, and in-course corrections are still possible. Decisions and ensuing movements do not occur in isolation. They are contextualized by past movements and the potential for growing self-awareness, through which recurring patterns among sources, developments, and outcomes can become more evident. Dispositions resolve source motivations in patterns of development. Gratitude, freedom in the use of gifts and talents, and a spirit of praise, reverence, and service can become habitual patterns that illuminate the discernment of movements toward and away from cooperation with divine missions. For Lonergan, the synchronic analysis of progress, decline, and redemption recognizes the complexity of social movements involving multiple actors and networks of interests and motivations. While this analysis of social movements shifts away from evaluating the authenticity and unauthenticity of individual actors, whether they are persons exercising authority or under the sway of those in authority, it serves as a proxy for assessing the authenticity of a tradition by discerning whether its development moves toward or away from closer union with the divine mission, affirming the dignity and integrity of all peoples and the cosmos as a whole. Lonergan's analysis of social movements in history introduces redemption as a third term to complement the assessment of the contending directions manifested in progress and decline. Recalling the narrative structure of the Ignatian examen invites us to locate this analysis of progress and decline in the third step, which implots events into an evaluative storyline. When this narrative resists being held by the dispositions of gratitude and divine light, failing to trust fully the encompassing benevolence of the created universe and its ultimate destiny, the fourth step and the third vector coincide in overcoming fear and despair with divine mercy. The love manifested in the Paschal mystery revalorizes the goodness of creation and confirms the social agency of human persons who become artisans of a new humanity and care for the common home of all creation, the fifth step of the examen. Lonergan identifies the tension between personal authenticity and unauthenticity within the social dialectic of progress and decline, both encompassed by a redemptive cosmological process that precedes, accompanies, and surpasses human history. Moments of darkness are woven into a transcendent narrative that creates renewed meaning and purpose as all things find their true value in the anakephaliosis. Think here of Ephesians 1:10, where nothing is lost to God's mercy and love. Gathering human journeys into the Paschal mystery does not involve rescuing creation from evil. Instead, it presents a significant healing of human agency and a reorientation of humanity towards a higher divine purpose. We do not save ourselves, nor does God save us without us. Human dignity is restored as we become agents in creating new stories about the past and charting the paths we will travel in the future. For Lonergan, the self-transcending human orientation toward truth, goodness, and beauty serves as a conscious expression of the source of this movement in and toward the divine. The Ignatian call to find God in all things resonates with this passion. Lonergan's early treatment of Aquinas' psychological analogy for the Trinitarian relations acts as a paradigmatic illustration in his theology of discovering and cooperating with the divine in the immediate moment. Specifically, Lonergan engages the profound Thomist insight into what it means to understand in a word rather than by a word. The act of understanding and the act of conceptualization share the same species. Nonetheless, Aquinas distinguishes them as separate acts. The act of conceptualization arises from the act of understanding as a distinct act flowing from another distinct act. While they share the same intelligible species, they are differentiated by the interrelation of one proceeding from the other. Furthermore, in both understanding and conceptualization, the species is not an imposition of an extrinsic form, but an intrinsic form that shapes the act itself. Hence, Aquinas claims we understand in an inner word rather than by a word. There is thus a double intimacy. First, there exists an inherent relationship between the species of the act of understanding and the act of conceptualization, which reflects the natural analog of the relationship between Father and Son. The interior concept arising from the act of understanding is identical in species but distinct in relationship with the inner word of understanding. Second, the act of understanding serves as a qualitative modification of the fundamental cognitive operations of a conscious, self-aware human subject. When we truly understand, rather than simply mimicking the public use of language, the quality of our being and actions in the world is transformed. A brief reflection on the synthesis report of the first session of the 16th General Ordinary Assembly of the Synod of Bishops, a synodal church in mission, illuminates the significance of this insight into the alignment among understanding, conceptualization, public expression, and finally, cooperation in social action. The report observes that the church does not have a mission, but rather asserts that the church is mission. Considering how members of the church share in the twofold mission of the Spirit and Word, we might think of ourselves as participating in the Spirit, who dwells intimately, transforming the quality of our very being as we strive to imitate or conform to the Word incarnate, crucified, and risen. Whereas the unity among the persons of the Trinity is perfect, distinguished only by their relations, the alignment among our transforming existence, our self-understanding, self-conceptualization, and public expression in word and deed remains imperfect and in process. To some extent, we remain mysteries to ourselves as we move in the Spirit to be shaped by the Word in thought, word, and action. The challenge, of course, is to live well-integrated lives where the self and the expressions of the self become ever more united. We become agents of the gospel who contribute wisely and generously to the flows of history, advancing progress, resisting decline, and embracing redemption. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you to Gordon, far away in Canada. So let's do the same thing. Would you permit me just to very briefly say a couple of things in summary of what we've heard? I think perhaps this was a dense talk. It's a sleepy time of afternoon, and it's that bit more difficult to listen to somebody who's not present with us in the room. I'd just like to point to a sort of a threefold structure to this talk that we've heard. Interesting, he began with an account of the dynamics of the exercise after the first few minutes of introduction about Lonergan. So just it's the exercises themselves and the internal dynamic of the different weeks, the examen of consciousness as a kind of fruit of the exercises. Then I'd like to sort of package what followed in just two steps. Well, let's remember first of all, staying with the point about the exercises. There is attentiveness to interiority in the exercises, and there is action, decision, election for action, contemplation in action. It's a paradoxical twofold dimension of the exercises. So flowing from that, the continuity between the exercises and Lonergan that Gordon Rixon was pointing out. So let's start with interiority, reflection on oneself. So here Lonergan talks about the conversion, the attentiveness to the empirical flow of experience, of consciousness, recognizing levels of consciousness, and that can be philosophically recognized, but our ability to actually behave authentically is transformed by an experience of grace. So this converted agency, and then there are levels of consciousness, but the precept for each level of consciousness is a good way to remember them. So under grace, and only in the healing process of grace, can we actually exercise what we are capable of, which includes being attentive, be intelligent, be rational, be responsible. And actually, to be in love is what's going to convert that to become possible. So finally, I move to the social implications. We're talking about action. Obviously, be responsible already means action, be oriented towards action. But there's this whole social cultural analysis in Lonergan, by extension from the analysis of authenticity that we can appropriate from ourselves and sinful divergence from authenticity. You have heuristic categories for the reading of history, the flow of history in terms of progress and decline. And just as we know that we remain sinners without grace, a supernatural third moment in our own consciousness, so we talk about, so to speak, a third vector in history, which is the redemption of history, that is constituted by communities of people, fragile but undergoing the transformation of grace. And the work of redemption is to reverse decline and promote progress in history. So it was very nicely captured in the very last slide of Gordon Rixon, which I haven't memorized and it's not in front of us now, but if you remember. So thank you for bearing with me for that summary of the Gordon Rixon talk. Can we take another moment of silence and just to think about questions? One point that we found especially enriching in Gordon's reflection. And any question that might emerge or comment for us. So now I hand over to Trevor. And we remember, obviously, the question time now, which we've maybe 15 minutes, pertains to both talks, Teilhard de Chardin and Lonergan. Trevor.
Thank you. I have a question for François. Thank you for your talk. I'm always interested to learn more about Teilhard. And I think the connection you were drawing between the anthropological and the cosmic in incarnation was very helpful. I suppose one thing that came up, and it was on your slide about mysticism, where you have this quote, to become at the same time and by the same act one with all through release from all multiplicity or material gravity. Mystic unity as unity above or beyond any multiplicity. And I'm wondering if that extends to being sort of in spite of multiplicity, or a collapse of diversity into unity for Teilhard. I mean, is there a vision of this cosmic progression that is I wonder how that vision relates to the question of diversity, and indeed the question of contradiction and disagreement, right? So how, in a Teilhardian way, do we account for the problem of disagreement and even more strongly contradiction. Put it that way.
Okay, thank you, Travis, for this very interesting question. It's maybe it's the first difficulty with Teilhard, which is not a philosopher. So it's interesting to understand by images. The first step is to understand that for him, the goal is communion, unity. Okay, well, we can understand it's better to be in communion than to be dispersed or opposed. Okay, and since for him, the process of evolution, the logic of evolution is from a situation of dispersion, multiplicity, pure multiplicity, toward a communion. Okay, that's right. But in fact, what is is a kind of, and it's resonance what you told this morning, is this unity or communion kind of something imposed from above, a reduction of multiplicity to a formal unity, or is this communion preserves the diversity? Another important quotation for Teilhard I didn't give is union differentiates. L'union différencie. Union differentiates. So the communion preserves the diversity. So there is a difference, in fact, between contradiction, position, that could be reduced, and the preservation of this diversity. But in fact, for Teilhard, it's not very precise. I mean, you have to interpret what he said. So I think it's not too difficult, but the difficulty in Teilhard is the precision of his vocabulary. It's easier to have the intuition, okay, well, I see the image, but in fact, for articulating conceptually, it's... well, thank you for the question.
Do you mind just note another question for François from the online participants. One person asks for a little bit more clarity on what Teilhard says about evolution and how that relates to his theology, some of the basic points. And then a question that is articulated as such: is there an established connection between incarnation and the ever-evolving reality of the world? The world is constantly changing and evolving. Will it be possible that some principles the Church holds onto dearly change, quote unquote, and follow the course of history?
Well, sure. Well, I can answer very easily. For Teilhard, the logic of incarnation doesn't lay on original sin. So there is a direct connection between creation and incarnation. Well, the process, the way of incarnation and life of Christ depends on the situation of the world. But for him, he is purely Scotist, if you want a designation. So, in fact, for him, there is a kind of parallel between, a critique that was made by Fessard. Do you confuse natural history with supernatural history? Teilhard didn't see exactly the difference between both. For him, due to the incarnation, the history, the normal meaning of the world is supernatural. You don't need to add something more, like a kind of put of sugar in your tea. This is exactly the same process, but of course, exactly. Usually, the one question is, maybe it will come. What does Teilhard think of evil? Because, okay. He recognizes the existence of original sin, the presence of evil in history. But for him, it doesn't command, it is not the engine of the history. The logic of history is supernatural, is revelation, is grace.
very much. Carlos will have a question now, but we notice we have with us Gordon Rixon. So welcome to Gordon. So I won't pretend that I'm Gordon Rixon. Answer. There's one question for him already online, and we only have 10 minutes, but let's see where what we're able to cover. Carlos, question.
You, both of them. Say the question for François. In the manuscript of Father de Lubac, du bon usage du milieu divin, Henri de Lubac wrote that the contemplatio ad amorem, la contemplación pour parvenir à l'amour, it's an hermeneutical key of spirituality of Teilhard, in particular of his sacramental vision of the Mother. My question is, Teilhard talks about the contemplatio ad amorem. Are you agree with this vision of the Lubac, or the Lubac is a little, you know, pushing the orthodoxy of Ignatian spirituality in Teilhard? Thank you.
As far as I remember, maybe, yes, maybe, I'm not quite sure. Probably we have his retreat notes, but he has his own way of practicing exercises. So I'm not sure that he will quote the Contemplatio ad Amorem. So I have to check it. Probably, well, the mission of de Lubac was to defend the orthodoxy of Teilhard. So, yeah, there is no position between the Contemplatio ad Amorem and what Teilhard wrote about spirituality. Okay, so, but I'm not sure that the exact reference. I will to check it. But yes, for de Lubac, Teilhard was real. Teilhard's spirituality was authentic, just his perspective. But concerning the quotation of the exercises, I'm not quite sure.
Thank you. You see, we have a question here from Shu Xiang Wu online, a very articulate Lonergan question for Gordon. Gordon, my question. How does Bernard Lonergan's epistemological framework of intentional consciousness and transcendental precepts provide a theological grounding for the Ignatian practice of discernment, particularly in relation to the dynamics of consolation and desolation in the spiritual exercises?
Hello, great. Thank you for the question. And just to say to François how much I appreciated his presentation. Teilhard was inspiration to me when I was young and thinking about the Jesuits, and really was one of the people that attracted me to this life. So I really do thank you for your reflections and your comments there. So, and I think probably the best way and probably the introduction that helps to appropriate some of Lonergan's insight really is to look for very concrete examples. And I think if you could imagine the experience of interacting, and I think of the experiences we've had with Indigenous communities in Canada, where there are voices that are sometimes not noticed, not listened to, that become very quiet because people speak over voices. And so the journey to noticing, both to notice what's happening in the self, but also what is happening to the other voice, really does, I think, speak to a historical process that is unfolding, and the ability to really notice what's happening in the self, and even more importantly, how to listen to the other, whose voice is often silenced by over-speaking, is really an introduction into this process. And of course, how is that oriented? How does that change the self and change the world? Is that when you do begin to notice, there is a possibility of responding and transforming the way one responds that begins to advance human dignity. So I think it is in very concrete historical examples that we can begin to engage some of these invitations to live lives that are grounded in the immediate moment and be able to step away from some of the patterns that are an affront to human dignity. So maybe that would be a little bit of a start of an idea of how to enter into some of this.
One more question, perhaps. Now I'm in a dilemma. If you don't mind, Patrick, in the back, yes, there. Yep.
Also the question about Theilhard de Chardin. Thank you so much for François Euvé, the presentation. I would like to know more about that. How can we understand the idea of the holy matter? Because in Theilhard spirituality, because traditionally, in the tradition of Christian spirituality, material world, to some extent, is a source of the temptation. So how can we understand the holiness or the sacred of the material world? I think this one is quite more helpful to us. And I remember that I read some of the articles before. Someone said that there is a small debate between Wang Bafasa and also de Lubac. Bafasa will think that because Theilhard de Chardin will very dangerous to lead us to move to the pantheism. Because you see everything, you see the God in everything. This, to some extent, this is not quite very good for us. But only the Lubac try to define Theilhard de Chardin and say that because traditionally the nature is being ignored in theology, in the tradition of theology. So Theilhard de Chardin tried to just to allow us to pay more attention on nature or universe or cosmos. This is a part very important for to doing the theology. So that means I have this kind of the idea. So it would be quite helpful to know more about how can we understand the holy matter, the idea of the holy matter. Thank you.
Well, of course, the concept of matter on Theilhard is very difficult to understand exactly what he means. The expression of holy matter is a bit provocative. That's clear, which is holiness, because you notice the twofold definition he gave of matter which is heavy and painful and so forth, and the opposite matter as a dynamism and so. But what I try to explain, the dynamism of matter, well, we have to concept matter as a dynamical concept. I mean, matter as an evolutionary concept, from the inner to the human person for Theilhard is a kind of accomplishment of matter because of the freedom. So it's matter in his. Well, I try to understand what he means by that. I mean, it's not exactly his words, but human person as a kind of accomplishment of matter because of the resurrection. Well, I alluded very briefly to the cross and resurrection. I insisted on incarnation, but in fact, I would say maybe it's as simple as that. The real matter is the spiritual body of risen Christ. Will it matter? But yes, it's not matter in the inert meaning of the word, so it's an attempt to transcend the so usual and too simple difference between matter and spirit. So if we begin with this matter and spirit traditional position or difference, I think for Theilhard, we need to translate it in a spiritual body, a spiritual matter.
Unfortunately, we have to wind down. If I may permit myself a reflection what François has just said, the Eucharist is holy matter. We remember Theilhard de Chardin, the Eucharist of the world. But it's paradoxical because there's a lot of supernatural there as well as natural, to use those medieval categories. But anyway, we close now for 30 minutes. I do have a suggestion. We only have one speaker in the next session, and then we have 30 minutes of discussion. Instead of pretending you were all that interested in that one speaker, we remember that this 30 minutes is the end of the day. So without preempting the moderator, we could allow these sort of questions to return in the next question time, not just of our two speakers now, but of our speakers this morning as well. Thank you.